In the closing chapters of World War II, as the Third Reich's industrial capacity crumbled under relentless Allied bombing, German engineers created one final tank destroyer that would embody both desperation and ingenuity, the Panzer XXXVIII, T. Hetzer. Born from necessity in late 1943, the Hetzer emerged from occupied Czechoslovakia's BMM factory, built upon the reliable chassis of the obsolete Panzer XXXVIII, T. Production began in April 1944, and by war's end, nearly 3,000 units had rolled off assembly lines, a remarkable achievement for a collapsing war machine. The Hetzer first saw combat in July 1944 on the Eastern Front, where its low silhouette and powerful 75mm Pak-39 gun proved deadly against Soviet T-34s and even the formidable IS-2 heavy tanks. It participated in the desperate defensive battles across Poland-Hungary and ultimately in the streets of Berlin itself. In the West, Hetzers fought in the Battle of the Bulge and the defense of the Rhine, earning grudging respect from Allied tank crews. What made the Hetzer formidable was its brilliant simplicity. Standing barely 2 meters tall, it was exceptionally difficult to spot and hit. Its sloped armor, 60mm at the front, could deflect all but the most powerful shells. The 75mm gun could penetrate 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters, making it lethal to most Allied tanks. Best of all, it was cheap and fast to produce, requiring only 150,000 Reichsmarks compared to the Panthers, 343,000. Yet the Hetzer was fundamentally flawed. Its cramped interior was a claustrophobic nightmare, 4 men squeezed into a space barely large enough for 3. The commander had almost no visibility, often forced to fight with the top hatch open, exposing himself to enemy fire. The gun could traverse only 11 degrees left and 5 degrees right, forcing the entire vehicle to turn for targeting. Ammunition storage was dangerously limited to just 41 rounds. The single access hatch on the right side became a death trap when the vehicle was hit. Crews often burned alive trying to escape. The Hetzer represents the contradiction of late-war German engineering. Tactically effective, yet operationally compromised, a weapon born from brilliance and desperation in equal measure. It was Germany's admission that the age of the supertank was over, replaced by the grim arithmetic of mass production and expendable machines for an unwinnable war. In the summer of 1943, Adolf Hitler ordered the deployment of a mechanical monster that would become one of World War II's most controversial armored vehicles, the Elephant, originally known as the Ferdinand. Born from hubris and desperation, this 65-ton behemoth represented both the pinnacle of German anti-tank firepower and a catastrophic failure in tactical design. The Elephant's story began with defeat, after Dr. Ferdinand Porsche lost the competition to design Germany's next heavy tank to the Tiger. 90% chassis he'd already built sat unused. Rather than scrap them, they were hastily converted into tank destroyers, mounting the formidable 88mm Pak-43 halves gun, the most powerful anti-tank weapon of its era, inside a massive armored casemate. The result was a 200mm thick fortress on tracks. Baptism of fire came at Kursk in July 1943, history's largest tank battle. Here, the Elephant's devastating gun achieved near-mythical kill ratios, destroying Soviet T-34s and KV-1s second from ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, distances where return fire was impossible. Reports claimed some Elephants achieved over 20 kills without suffering penetrating hits. The armor was virtually impervious to Soviet anti-tank guns. At Kursk also exposed the Elephant's fatal flaw. It had no machine gun. None. When Soviet infantry swarmed these isolated giants, crews were helpless. Molotov cocktails, magnetic mines, and satchel charges turned invincible fortresses into burning coffins. Of the 89 elephants committed to Kursk, only a handful survived the week, not from enemy tanks, but from infantry they couldn't defend against. After Kursk's disaster, surviving vehicles were recalled and modified. A bow-mounted machine gun was added, and the name changed from Ferdinand to Elephant, perhaps to distance the vehicle from its humiliation. They were redeployed to Italy in 1944, fighting at Anzio and in the defense of Rome, where their gun remained devastatingly effective in the mountainous terrain. The Elephant's virtues were undeniable: unmatched firepower, impenetrable frontal armor, and the psychological impact of a seemingly indestructible machine. Its 88mm gun could penetrate any Allied tank at virtually any range. Mechanically, the electric drive system, though complex, provided smooth power delivery and surprising maneuverability for its size, but the flaws were equally stark. At 65 tons, it was painfully slow and consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. The electric transmission was maintenance-intensive and prone to failure. The lack of a turret meant limited tactical flexibility. Most damning was the initial absence of defensive armament, a design oversight so fundamental it defied military logic. Crews needed supporting infantry at all times, making the independent tank destroyer anything but independent. The Elephant stands as a monument to German engineering brilliance undermined by tactical blindness, a weapon that could kill anything it could see, but couldn't defend itself from a determined soldier with a bottle of gasoline. While Tiger tanks captured headlines and imaginations, Germany's true armored workhorse quietly destroyed more enemy tanks than any other Wehrmacht vehicle, the Sturmgeschütz III, or Stug III. This low-slung assault gun became the backbone of German armored forces, fighting on every front from 1940 to the war's final day in 1945. Stug III began life with humble intentions. Designed in the late 1930s as mobile artillery to support infantry assaults, it mounted a short-barreled 75mm gun on the reliable Panzer III chassis enclosed in an armored casemate. Its mission was simple: blast fortifications and machine gun nests at close range. When it debuted during the French campaign of 1940, it performed exactly as intended, rumbling alongside infantry to provide direct fire support. But war has a way of reshaping weapons. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Panzer crews encountered a nasty surprise: the T-34, a tank superior to anything in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. By 1942, desperation drove innovation. The Stug III received a longer, high-velocity 75mm gun, the same weapon mounted on the Panzer IV, transforming it from an assault gun into a lethal tank destroyer. Third, evolution made the Stug III ubiquitous. It fought in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the vast tank battles of Kursk, the deserts of North Africa alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps, the mountains of Italy, the beaches of Normandy, and the rubble-choked streets of Berlin. Over 10,500 were produced, more than any other German armored vehicle, serving not just Germany, but also Finland, Romania, Hungary, Italy, and Spain. The Stug III's strengths were substantial and practical. Its low silhouette, barely 2 meters tall, made it difficult to spot and hit, a crucial advantage in defensive combat. The turretless design was cheaper and faster to manufacture than traditional tanks, requiring 30% less man-hours to build. Its 75mm gun could penetrate most Allied tanks at combat ranges, while its frontal armor, eventually upgraded to 80mm, provided solid protection. Crucially, it was mechanically reliable, using the proven Panzer III drivetrain that crews understood and could repair in the field. Stug III crews became elite hunters. Legendary commanders like Michael Wittmann began their careers in assault guns. The vehicle claimed over 20,000 enemy tanks destroyed during the war. a staggering total that exceeded all German tank destroyers combined. Why? The Stu G3's limitations were inherent to its design. The lack of a rotating turret meant limited gun traverse, only 20 degrees left and right, forcing the entire vehicle to turn for targeting, exposing its thin side armor. Situational awareness was poor. The commander had restricted vision through periscopes, making the crew vulnerable to ambush and infantry assault. In offensive operations requiring maneuver and flexibility, the Stu G3 struggled. It excelled in defensive warfare but was tactically inflexible in fluid combat. The Stu G3 represents pragmatic German engineering at its finest, not the most glamorous weapon, but reliable, effective, and producible in meaningful numbers when the Reich needed it most. In the desperate mathematics of total war, Germany faced a persistent problem: how to provide mobile artillery support when resources were scarce and time was running out. The answer came in 1942 with the Bison, Sturmpanzer II, a crude but effective self-propelled gun that married Czech chassis with German firepower, creating one of the war's most unusual artillery platforms. The Bison was born from necessity and captured equipment. After Germany's conquest of Czechoslovakia, hundreds of obsolete Panzer II light tank chassis sat in depots, too weak for modern tank warfare, but too valuable to scrap. German engineers devised a pragmatic solution: remove the turret, install a high, box-like armored superstructure, and mount a 15 cm SIG 33 heavy infantry gun inside. The result was ungainly and top-heavy, but it worked. Two primary variants emerged. The early Bison I, produced in limited numbers in 1942, mounted the gun directly on the Panzer II chassis. The more common Bison II, entering service in late 1942 and early 1943, used the improved Panzer XXXVIII chassis from occupied Czech factories. Approximately 370 units were manufactured before production ceased in 1944, replaced by more sophisticated designs. These vehicles saw extensive combat across multiple theaters. Bison units fought on the Eastern Front during the brutal battles of 1942 to 1944, providing close artillery support during urban combat at Stalingrad and throughout the defensive campaigns in Ukraine and Belarus. They served in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps, though the desert's heat and terrain proved challenging. In Italy, Bison supported German defensive operations from Sicily through the Gothic Line. By 1944, surviving units fought in France during the Normandy campaign and later in the desperate defense of the Reich itself. The Bison's primary strength was its powerful main armament. The 15 cm SIG 33 howitzer fired devastating high-explosive shells weighing 38 kilograms, capable of demolishing fortifications, obliterating infantry positions, and destroying light vehicles with a single shot. The track chassis provided mobility that towed artillery couldn't match, allowing it to advance with infantry and provide immediate fire support. In urban warfare, where buildings provided defensive positions, the Bison excelled at reducing strongpoints at close range. The vehicle was also relatively simple to produce and maintain. Using existing chassis and proven artillery pieces, it required minimal new tooling or specialized components, crucial for Germany's strained war industry. Crews familiar with the Panzer XXXVIII or Panzer II could transition easily, yet the Bison was fundamentally flawed. The high, boxy superstructure made it an enormous target. Concealment was nearly impossible. The armor was thin, just 10 to 15 mm in most places, offering protection only against small arms and shrapnel. A single anti-tank round would penetrate catastrophically. The gun's elevation was limited, restricting its use in mountainous terrain and making indirect fire difficult. Most critically, the design was dangerously top-heavy. The combination of a massive gun mounted high in a light chassis made the vehicle unstable on slopes and rough terrain. Crews reported feeling the vehicle would tip over during sharp turns. The open-topped fighting compartment left the four-man crew exposed to artillery airburst. grenades, and aerial attack. Ammunition storage was severely limited, just 15 rounds, and the shells were so large and heavy that reloading under fire was slow and exhausting. Range was poor, barely 185 kilometers, and mechanical reliability suffered under the strain of the heavy weapon. The Bison represented classic German improvisation, taking what was available and creating something functional, if imperfect, filling a critical need when proper solutions were impossible. In the dying days of the Third Reich, as Soviet armies closed in from the east and Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble, Adolf Hitler's engineers were building the largest tank ever constructed, the Panzer VIII Maus. Weighing 188 tons, heavier than 3 Sherman tanks combined, this steel leviathan represented the ultimate expression of Hitler's obsession with superweapons and his catastrophic detachment from military reality. The Maus was born from megalomania. In 1942, as Germany's fortunes began their irreversible decline, Hitler demanded a breakthrough tank that would render all Allied armor obsolete. Ferdinand Porsche, eager to regain favor after his Tiger design lost to Henschel, proposed something audacious, a land battleship armed with a 128mm main gun and a coaxial 75mm cannon, protected by armor up to 240mm thick, impervious to any weapon in existence. Development dragged through 1943 and 1944 at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds. 2 prototypes were built. The first, V1, received its turret in June 1944. The same month the Allies landed at Normandy. The second, V2, was completed months later. Neither would ever see combat. By late April 1945, as Soviet forces approached the testing facility, German engineers destroyed both prototypes to prevent capture. The Soviets recovered the remains and, in a strange historical footnote, combined parts from both hulls to create one functioning vehicle, which now sits in the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow. The Maus's theoretical capabilities were staggering. Its 128mm gun could destroy any Allied tank from ranges exceeding 3,500 meters. The armor was essentially impenetrable. Even the feared Soviet 122mm gun would struggle at point-blank range. The secondary 75mm gun provided versatility against lighter vehicles and fortifications. Inside, the crew of 6 operated in relative spaciousness, a luxury unknown in most German tanks. Yet the Maus was less a weapon than a monument to strategic insanity. At 188 tons, it was too heavy for virtually any bridge in Europe. Rivers would have to be crossed underwater using a snorkel system, a complex, vulnerable procedure. Top speed was a pathetic 13 miles per hour on roads, perhaps 6 miles per hour cross-country. Fuel consumption was apocalyptic, barely 1.2 miles per gallon, meaning a range of just 115 miles. In a Germany strangled by fuel shortages, the Maus would have been immobile. The tactical problems were equally damning. Its size made concealment impossible. Allied aircraft would spot it instantly. The weight meant it couldn't maneuver in forests, urban areas, or soft ground. Most critically, by 1944, the sky belonged to Allied air forces. Rocket-armed Typhoons and Thunderbolts would have attacked with impunity, while the Maus lumbered helplessly below. Production demands were obscene. Each Maus required resources that could build 8 Panzer IV or V Panthers, proven designs that could actually reach the battlefield. Germany needed thousands of tanks. Instead, engineers devoted precious capacity to a vehicle that couldn't function in modern warfare. The Maus stands as the perfect symbol of Nazi Germany's terminal phase, technologically impressive yet strategically worthless, born from a regime that had lost all connection to reality, building superweapons while the nation collapsed around them. By 1943, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies. German armored columns advancing across open terrain faced a terrifying reality. They would be hunted mercilessly by swarms of Allied fighter bombers. In response, German engineers created a series of stopgap solutions, among them the Flakpanzer 38T, a Czech tank chassis transformed into a mobile anti-aircraft platform that would serve on every front during the war's final years. The Flakpanzer 38T was born from necessity and pragmatism. With the obsolete Panzer 38T light tank chassis already in production at the BMM factory in occupied Czechoslovakia, German designers removed the turret and mounted a single 20 mm Flak 38 anti-aircraft gun in an open-topped armored superstructure. Production began in November 1943, and by war's end, approximately 140 units had been manufactured, a modest number reflecting Germany's collapsing industrial capacity. These vehicles first saw action in late 1943 and early 1944, deployed primarily with Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions on the Eastern Front. They accompanied German armored formations during the desperate defensive battles across Ukraine and Poland, providing crucial protection against Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft. In the West, Flakpanzer 38T units fought in Normandy after D-Day, in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, and in the final defense of Germany itself in 1945. The vehicle's strengths lay in its simplicity and versatility. The 20 mm Flak 38 was a proven weapon, capable of firing 420 rounds per minute up to an effective altitude of 2,200 meters. Against low-flying aircraft, the primary threat to ground forces, it was deadly. The tracked chassis provided mobility that towed anti-aircraft guns couldn't match, allowing it to keep pace with advancing panzer columns. Armor protection of 10 to 50 mm shielded the crew from small arms fire and shrapnel. Crucially, the Flakpanzer proved equally effective in ground combat. The 20 mm cannon was devastating against infantry, light vehicles, and soft-skinned targets. In urban warfare, it excelled at suppressing enemy positions in buildings. Many crews found themselves fighting ground targets more often than aircraft, the vehicle evolving into an improvised infantry support weapon. Yet the Flakpanzer 38T suffered from fundamental limitations. The open-topped design left the four-man crew exposed to artillery fragments, grenades, and overhead attacks, ironic for a vehicle meant to defend against aerial threats. The single 20 mm gun, while effective against fighters and light bombers, was inadequate against heavily armored ground attack aircraft like the Il-2, which could withstand multiple hits. Against Allied Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts armed with rockets and heavy cannons, the Flakpanzer was outmatched. Magazine capacity was painfully limited, just 20 rounds, requiring constant reloading during engagements. The rate of fire, while impressive, burned through ammunition rapidly, and resupply in combat conditions was difficult and dangerous. The chassis itself, based on an obsolete pre-war design, was mechanically reliable but increasingly inadequate as the war progressed. By 1944, the Flakpanzer 38T was already a compromise solution, a weapon built from available components rather than optimal design. It represented Germany's reality, fighting a losing war with whatever could be scrapped together, defending against an enemy that owned the skies completely. Before the Tiger, before the Panther, before Germany's fearsome reputation for armored warfare, there was the Panzer I, a tiny, lightly armed machine that would inadvertently birth the tactical revolution known as Blitzkrieg. This modest two-man tank, never intended for frontline combat, became the foundation upon which Hitler's panzer divisions were built and blooded. The Panzer I emerged from Germany's secret rearmament in the early 1930s, when the Treaty of Versailles still forbade German tank production. Officially designated a tractor to avoid Allied scrutiny, it entered production in 1934 as a training vehicle, a platform to teach German soldiers tank tactics while heavier combat tanks were being designed. armed with just two 7.92mm machine guns and protected by a maximum of 13mm of armor. It was never meant to fight other tanks. Yet when war came, the Panzer I was thrust into combat. It debuted in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, where German volunteers of the Condor Legion tested their tactics and machines against Soviet-supplied T-26 tanks and anti-tank guns. The Panzer I's inadequacies became immediately apparent. Its machine guns couldn't penetrate enemy armor, and its own thin plating offered no protection against anti-tank weapons. Despite these glaring weaknesses, the Panzer I spearheaded Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939. Of the 2,800 tanks in the Wehrmacht's arsenal, nearly 1,500 were Panzer Is. They rolled through France and the Low Countries in 1940, participated in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece in 1941, and even fought in the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in June 1941. By 1942, they saw service in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps, though by then they were hopelessly obsolete. The Panzer I's strengths lay not in combat capability, but in doctrine and training. It taught an entire generation of German tank commanders the principles of mobile warfare, speed, coordination, and aggressive maneuver. Officers like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel honed their revolutionary tactics in these machines. The Panzer I was fast for its era, reaching 37 kilometers per hour on roads, allowing German formations to move with unprecedented speed. It was mechanically reliable, easy to maintain and simple to produce in large numbers, providing the mass necessary to overwhelm enemies through sheer tactical excellence rather than firepower. The psychological impact was also significant. In Poland and France, the sight of hundreds of tanks advancing in coordinated waves created panic, even if many were just machine gun carriers. The Panzer I helped establish the myth of German invincibility that would define the early war years. But the limitations were devastating. The twin machine guns were useless against any armored vehicle, relegating the Panzer I to infantry support and reconnaissance, roles that exposed it to anti-tank weapons it couldn't survive. The armor couldn't stop anything heavier than rifle rounds. Even heavy machine guns could penetrate at close range. The two-man crew was severely overworked. The commander had to command, load, aim, and fire both guns while maintaining situational awareness. By 1941, facing modern tanks like the Soviet T-34 and KV-1, the Panzer I was a death trap. Crews called them coffins on tracks. Production ceased in 1937, but desperation kept them in service far longer than intended. Many were converted into command vehicles, ammunition carriers, and self-propelled gun platforms, roles where their obsolescence was less fatal. The Panzer I's true legacy wasn't its combat record, but what it taught. It was the training ground for Blitzkrieg, the platform that transformed the Wehrmacht into history's most formidable mechanized force, proving that doctrine and training could matter as much as steel and guns. While tanks captured the glory, Germany's revolutionary approach to armored warfare relied equally on a less celebrated vehicle, the SDKFC. 251 half-track, universally known as the Hanomag, after its primary manufacturer. This versatile armored personnel carrier became the defining vehicle of the Panzer Grenadiers, motorized infantry who could keep pace with tanks and fight from their vehicles, transforming the very nature of mechanized warfare. Development began in 1938, and the first SDKFC 251 seconds rolled off production lines in 1939, just in time for the invasion of Poland. Over the next 6 years, more than 15,000 would be manufactured in 23 different variants, serving every conceivable role from troop transport to ambulance, from mortar carrier to mobile command post, from anti-aircraft platform to rocket launcher. The Hanomag saw action on every front where Germany fought. It spearheaded the Blitzkrieg through France in 1940, where Panzer grenadiers riding in their half-tracks exploited breakthrough opportunities with unprecedented speed. In North Africa, they supported Rommel's desert campaigns from 1941 to 1943, though sand and heat proved challenging for the vehicles. On the Eastern Front, from the initial invasion of the Soviet Union through the desperate retreats of 1944-45, the SD KFC 251 became the Wehrmacht's workhorse, transporting troops through mud, snow, and the vast distances of Russia. They fought in Italy's mountains, landed at Anzio, defended Normandy's beaches, and participated in the desperate Ardennes offensive. Some even mounted the first infrared night vision equipment used in combat, hunting Allied tanks in darkness. The Hanomag's strengths were transformative. Its armored body, 14 mm at the front, 8 mm on the sides, protected the 10-man squad from small arms fire and shrapnel, while allowing them to fight from the vehicle through firing ports and over the open top. The half-track design provided excellent cross-country mobility, far superior to wheeled vehicles, while being simpler and more fuel-efficient than fully tracked vehicles. It could traverse mud, snow, and rough terrain that would immobilize trucks. Critically, it kept infantry synchronized with tanks. Panzer grenadiers could advance under fire, dismount at the objective, and fight immediately. No longer were infantry forced to lag behind armored spearheads. This tactical integration made German combined arms operations devastatingly effective. The vehicle's versatility was extraordinary. The basic chassis spawned variants carrying 75 mm anti-tank guns, 81 mm mortars, multiple rocket launchers, the dreaded Stuka Zu Fuss, anti-aircraft guns and communication equipment. Yet the SD KFC 251 had significant vulnerabilities. The open top left troops, exposed to artillery airburst, grenades, and aerial attack. A deadly weakness on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery dominated. The armor, while adequate against rifles, couldn't stop anti-tank rifles, heavy machine guns at close range, or any anti-tank weapon. The exposed engine at the front was vulnerable to damage. Fuel consumption was heavy, roughly 2.5 miles per gallon, limiting operational range. Production was complex and labor-intensive. Early models required skilled welders and precision manufacturing, making them expensive and slow to build. Not until 1943 did simplified AUSF. D variants with welded rather than riveted armor improved production rates. Even then, Germany never produced enough. Most Panzer Grenadier divisions relied on trucks for the majority of their infantry, with half-tracks reserved for elite formations. Mechanically, the vehicle was reasonably reliable, but the complicated half-track suspension required constant maintenance. Spare parts became scarce as the war progressed, leaving many vehicles abandoned due to mechanical failure rather than combat damage. The SD Doc 251 represented the realization of mechanized warfare's promise, infantry that could exploit breakthroughs as rapidly as tanks, turning tactical victories into operational collapse. It made Blitzkrieg possible.